Good afternoon or good evening, depending on what time zone you're joining us from today. Welcome to The Open Mind, a lecture and film series that brings together thought leaders in science and culture for meaningful and relevant discussions about mental health. This program is proudly sponsored by the Friends of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior at UCLA and the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors. I'm Vicki Goodman, and I'm excited and honored to welcome today's featured speaker, Dr. Chantel Prat, author of The Neuroscience of You, How Every Brain is Different and How to Understand Yours. In Dr. Prat's critically acclaimed book that Adam Grant, author of Think Again, describes as the smartest, clearest, and funniest book I've ever read about the brain, she focuses on the intricate differences in our brains and explains how these small differences can scale up to large differences in the way we think, feel, and behave. Dr. Prat is a professor at the University of Washington with appointments in the Department of Psychology, Neuroscience, and Linguistics, and at the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences. A cognitive neuroscientist by training, her interdisciplinary research investigates individual differences in cognition with an emphasis on understanding the ways different brains learn and communicate. Her studies have been profiled in media ranging from Scientific American and Psychology Today to Rolling Stone and Popular Mechanics. The Neuroscience of You, her debut book, has been nominated for the Next Big Idea Club and the Washington State Book Awards. And Dr. Prat was prominently featured in the critically acclaimed 2009 documentary, I Am Human. We're also honored to welcome back to The Open Mind one of our favorite Semel Institute faculty members, Dr. Edythe London, Distinguished Professor in Residence and the Pike Chair of Addiction Studies at the Semel Institute and Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences and the Department of Molecular and Medical Pharmacology at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. Dr. London's work focuses on neurochemical and circuit-level abnormalities to inform evidence-based treatments for addiction. Bridging psychiatry, pharmacology, and neuroscience, her work has provided many notable firsts, such as mapping drug-induced euphoria and drug craving in the human brain, visualizing the cerebral distributions of actions of abused drugs, and developing probes for external brain imaging, just to mention a few. Now, before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. Today's program will run for approximately 1 hour, with the last segment reserved for your questions. If you would like to ask either of our speakers a question, we ask that you please type it into the Q&A located at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will do our best to get to as many questions as possible. We have nearly 1,600 people registered for today's program, so we really appreciate your patience and understanding. Today's program is being recorded and will be available for viewing on our YouTube channel, which you can find on our beautiful new website, friendsofthesemelinstitute.org. There you will also find a library of videos from past Open Mind programs, a calendar of upcoming events, information about the Friends Scholar Program, the Open Mind Film Festival for high school students that will be held virtually on April 30th, our new Teen Advisory Council, and WOW 2023, the Mental Health Summit, which will be held on May 4th at Royce Hall with special guest Oprah Winfrey. We hope you will join us for all of these exciting and informative programs. And now please join me in giving a warm Zoom welcome to Dr. Chantel Prat and Dr. Edythe London. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're still muted.
Moment. Thank you very much, Vicki. And a hearty thanks to the Friends for sponsoring this wonderful event. And I'd just like to start by saying how thrilled I am to meet Chantel and to hear about this really exciting and timely book about what makes me, me. And I wonder if we could start by having you tell us a little bit about why you wrote this book.
Thank you so much. The feeling is mutual. I think we'll talk about brains of a feather flocking together, and being invited to join in this conversation with you is thrilling. And I mean, Dr. London and all of you who are here live, and those of you who will log in later to hear about this book. Because the long and the short of it is that my why for writing this book is you. I really want to help people get to know themselves the way I know them. And by that, I mean, by understanding how our unique brain designs combine with a lifetime of experience to shape the way we think, feel, and behave in this world. After all, it doesn't make sense that I know more about your brain, this thing that's driving you through life, than you do. So I feel incredibly grateful every time somebody shows up to learn about their brain. I hope I never, ever, ever take that for granted, because I think it's really important. And I hope that my book, which is full of not only new science about individual differences and how they drive the way we think, feel, and behave, but also quizzes and questionnaires that allow you to reverse engineer your brain. My first hope in writing the book is that it'll give people kind of a user manual to how their brain works and answer your at least one burning "why am I like this" question. So, I think that most research has a little bit of me search in it. And my work, even when I was going through the process of writing the book, was so full of why am I like this? Like, why is my brain doing these things that I find so frustrating sometimes? And I hope that by sort of defining the space and the place that is normal and variable brains and how they work, that I can help you learn to appreciate, not only accept, but appreciate and maybe even come to love this brilliant organ that makes you you. And I have one sort of larger goal that drove my why for writing the book. And that is that, so obviously, number one, I want to introduce you to your brain, but a bigger sort of goal that has more of a societal importance is that I want to help give people the tools for actually understanding brains that work differently from theirs. So it feels to me that over the past, I would say 5 to 10 years, but really in the past 5 years, this has been a pressure cooker, that we're living in this kind of social paradox where we are increasingly acknowledging the value of diversity and inclusion. We're increasingly aware that our decision spaces are better when we have diverse people with diverse perspectives in them. But at the same time, I don't see us getting better at connecting across our differences. So we're kind of espousing these values for diversity, but yet I think our values are getting ahead of our tools for understanding minds that work differently, because people who come from different backgrounds or who have different perspectives than you are driven by different brains shaped by different experiences. And I think that it's the very social brain that craves connection with others that also drives us to hang out with other people who work like we do. It makes us feel good when we're with other people whose brains work like ours do. And in fact, social neuroscience is showing this more and more convincingly, even in the last 2 to 3 years, that brains of a feather flock together. That is, you can predict by measuring the connectivity of someone's brain how likely they are to be friends with another person, even when you control for things like personality, age, and gender. This was one study that was conducted on an entire village on an island outside of South Korea. I think there were 800 people. They created a social network based on the entire population of this village, and then scanned a subset of that population's brains and showed that you could figure out who would be friends with whom based on how their brains work. I think this is because our most instinctive way of connecting with others is through mirroring. It's the way social primate brains, at least, learn from others. It allows us to learn by observing the behaviors of other people. So if I see somebody else behaving a certain way, my brain automatically tries to guess which motor programs, tries to put itself in the state that would make me behave in that way. So we do this with motor actions, with grasping. We do it with language. When we're listening to speech sounds, when you're all listening to my probably too fast speech sounds, so I'll calm down. I get really excited and I talk fast. When you're listening to this stream of continuous speech, your brain is actually modeling the motor program that your mouth, tongue, teeth, and nose and larynx, vocal cords would create to make those same sounds. And it uses that model as a way of understanding what's happening. But what happens when the brain you're trying to understand is different than your brain? So what happens when the behavior that you're observing is driven by a brain that doesn't work like yours? When you use these instinctive ways of connecting, which may also drive feelings like empathy, feeling with this very easy way that we're born with, you're going to get it wrong. Sort of the assumption of putting yourself in someone's shoes, which really just means if my brain was doing that thing, what would the conditions be that support that behavior? You're going to get it wrong. You're going to make the wrong inference when you try and figure out what's driving another person. So it's easy and it feels good when we try and connect with someone else whose brain works like ours. So how do we connect with people who work differently? Again, this is the bigger goal. I think, fortunately, our human brains have other powerful ways for understanding one another, not just the one that we were born with that leads little kids to cover their eyes when they're trying to make you disappear. Most of us still use that kind of gut feeling to assess people, but we have other tools. We can understand each other using the same kind of systems we use to try and understand astronomy or quantum physics or anything that we can't directly observe. We can build mental models of others, but doing that requires some understanding about how different brains work, which is why I wrote the book. And it also involves a lot of work. So the good news is that this kind of theory of mind or mind modeling ability seems to be entirely learned. Like, I don't think I've ever seen a behavioral genetics study. This one was done on over 1,000 pairs of twins that showed zero contributions of genetics. That is, if you look at identical or monozygotic twins and how closely they resemble one another in this mind modeling ability, it is exactly the same as siblings who share, 25% of their genes, 25% less gene, or 100 to 50. And it's exactly the same. So this ability to understand others is entirely learned, which is why I hope that my book will give people some tools for figuring out what are the different axes of brain function and how do those drive different ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving in the world. But the last thing I want to say, the last point I want to make in this sort of umbrella of why did I write the book is that if we're going to do the work to understand and I hope appreciate points of view of people who work differently, I think the number one thing we have to do is relax our beliefs about how correct we are. And also that our own way of being is the good or the right way of being. This is so fundamental to the way that we operate that I think we're largely unaware of how much our idea of what is correct and what is good is just driven by a specific perspective that our brain has created for us. So I like to take people to a fun example, which was the dress that took the internet by storm in 2015, because we couldn't agree about whether it was blue and black or white and gold. So what I think that example shows is two things, maybe three. The first is that even something as elementary as color is open for interpretation in your brain. So many of us learned at some point that the color that we see is related to some real property of the physical world, and that is a light wave, the length of a light wave. And that you might have even learned that there are cones in the back of your eye that absorb light at different, frequencies and send signals to your brain telling you what color you see. So how can we not agree on the color of a dress? And the answer is that our brain does not do a one-on-one mapping of color. And if it did, we would all see a green dress turn red in the sunset and blue in a shadow, or an apple or anything. We would see things changing color all the time. Instead, your magnificent inferential brain learns that things are less likely to change color than are the properties of the light bouncing off of things. So it does what we all do when we're trying to understand the world around us at many different levels, and it takes the context into account. It takes a sample of the light, the colors that you're seeing bouncing off lots of things around you, and it subtracts out what it believes is the kind of common denominator, like this is what the light is like, and then decides. So when context is missing, as in the color of a dress, that those inferential processes, that world building, that guessing that your brain does becomes more obvious. And all of a sudden it captures the world by storm, right? So number one, our brains are creating our own reality with incomplete information all the time. We see that with the dress. Number two, different brains create different versions of reality. And it's weird and strange to us when it's something perceptual, like the color of a dress or whether you're hearing Laurel or Yanni. But if it occurs even at that level, imagine how things scale up to our beliefs and et cetera. More abstract world building things that our brain does. The third thing that I think the dress illustrates is that no matter what I say to you today, the reality that your brain builds for you is darned convincing, right? So my husband, who's also a neuroscientist, funnily, so he sees white and gold and I see blue and black. The dress is actually blue and black. And if you see white and gold, it's because your brain is assuming that it's lit from behind and that it's in a shadow and is subtracting blue and black. And my husband says, I cannot believe the dress itself is wrong. And this is just shows you that the world that your brain builds for you is incredibly convincing. So if we're going to try and understand others, we have to start by questioning our reality and by at least being willing to accept the fact that our reality is one version built by a brain with one set of design characteristics that may or may not be the only way to see it, may or may not be the correct way to see it, may or may not be the best way to see the world. Because if we don't do that, then instead of feeling curious about another human, which is, I think, understanding another human is probably the hardest job our brains do. Instead of feeling curious, you're going to feel threatened. And psychological threat shuts down that willingness to try and work. So the last little tidbit of information I want to give you is that these differences in brain design, these differences in experience do not necessarily have to map on to better or worse. Brains take a large number of shapes. They vary on a large number of axes. And there's tons of research showing that different brains will thrive. These different brain designs have costs and benefits, and people who occupy different spaces in this brain design world will thrive in different sort of, when you ask their brains to solve a different problem. So a quick anecdote is that Eleanor Maguire, an Irish neuroscientist, in 2000, sort of took the world by storm by showing that taxi drivers in London had different brains than age and gender and IQ match controls. And that in particular, there was a part of their brain in the backside of the hippocampus, a memory region, that was larger. It turns out that this is because cab drivers have to memorize 20,000 maps in order to get their license to drive a taxi in London. And follow-up studies showed that it wasn't that these cab drivers had bigger memory regions to start, but rather that when they went about studying these 20,000 maps, that part of their brain that's responsible for spatial memory grew. However, there was a cost to that. And when McGuire put taxi drivers in head-to-head literal and figurative competitions with bus drivers, she showed that the taxi drivers were better at remembering sort of spatial locations, landmarks, distances, than the bus drivers, but were worse at remembering new information like lists of words. In other words, their brains had become adapted to this very specific job and had gotten better at something with a measurable cost at the neighboring function in the front of the hippocampus. There are lots and lots of examples of this in the book, and I don't have time to talk about them all, but you'll have to trust me that there are some really good reasons that your brain is the way it is. And I hope that you can learn to appreciate that different doesn't need to be better or worse, and that your way is just one way.
Well, thanks so much for that really wonderful synopsis of this exciting book. I'm just wondering if we could get started with maybe a playful question. Given that we're living in this brave new world right now, is it possible to use brain scans and look at the connectivity of someone's brain in identifying an optimal life partner?
Oh man, not only is that possible, I would be really surprised if it's not already happening. Just the social neuroscience is showing so many cool things. Like you can tell how good of a team people will be by how in sync their brain waves are, or like how good they'll be at problem solving. And these, like, there's a new paradigm called hyperscanning, where you put two people in two different brain scanning devices at the same time, or, offline, but you're really looking for synergy between brains. And I think that is really cool. However, so yes, but the question would be, how do you define optimal? Because I feel really confident that I could pick somebody who you would get along with well. Somebody who thinks just like you. Like our behaviors every day show that we feel good and we feel safe and we feel validated when we're around a whole bunch of an echo chamber, right? Other people and other sort of points of view, social media, et cetera, of people who agree with us. However, so my personal experiment here, I'm going on 13 years of marriage, like I said, with another cognitive neuroscientist. So he thinks in pictures, I think in words. He is I didn't talk about one of the differences I think is really interesting is how we learn from feedback. He is extremely what I would call a D2 avoider. He moves through life by getting feedback about what won't work. And I'm exactly the opposite. He's introverted, I'm extroverted. Those things are related to one another. And, over the 13 years of our lives, there are a lot of ways that we've grown more similar with increased shared experiences. But I would argue that while it's not as easy for me to coexist with him, I have grown in interesting ways. And I think we're a freaking amazing super team because we think differently, and possibly because we both have that insight to say, hey, like, even if I still feel 100% like he's wrong, I can think and use science to say, like, oh, maybe, this is just a different perspective and it's a valuable one. So the question would be, like, we know that opposites don't really attract. The social experiment that is life shows that we're more likely to be around people who work like we do, but does that get old and boring? Is that not offering opportunities for growth and for you as a super team to be better? The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So the question would be, what algorithm do we use to find that perfect match?
Sure. Well, a lot of our behavior is what decisions we make, right? And you did some really good treatment in the book about how feedback influences our decisions and whether or not a person is flexible and can learn from feedback gives them an edge in the world. And you also just now talked about whether someone is a chooser or an avoider, and their brains are different. Which group has a better chance of learning from feedback?
Oh, gosh, that is such a good question. So I want to take a step back and say that something that I find really interesting at being an educator and being someone who studies learning is that if you ask somebody what kind of a learner they are, I feel very confident that no one's going to say, I'm a stick learner. I learn from negative feedback, or I learn from positive feedback. People will tell you, I am a visual learner. I am an experiential learner. I am a tactile learner, or I am a verbal learner. And it turns out that learning styles, research on learning styles, those kind of learning styles shows that while people will stably discuss how they prefer to learn, there's no strong evidence that they actually learn better that way. They might prefer to learn that way, but then if you present the information in different ways and give them a test, they don't necessarily remember more from the way that they like to learn. What I think is really interesting about this, and what you sort of just explicitly said, is that, well, you said part of it, is that this ability, this sort of reflection on what kind of a learner you are, is really specific to learning from instruction. And when we think about learning, we often think, oh, I would like to watch YouTube videos to figure out how to cook, or like, how did I learn in the classroom? But this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to how human brains learn. And the vast majority of the learning we do is the way that every other behaving animal on the planet learns, from feedback, from our decisions, from trial and error. And so first of all, that feedback is not always in the environment around us. Sometimes it's internally generated. And I think that's really important when you think about who learns from feedback and how it feels if somebody says, like, this is not up to standard. I'm seeing the comments pop up, and I'm going to close them because my brain is distractible, organically driven, and not able to not see things that pop up. So here's how it works in a nutshell. I am kind of a sports fan. I don't have as much time to watch sports as I used to. But your brain creates a playbook for your entire life. And basically all of learning to perceive and understand the world around you exists, I think, because your brain goes, okay, now that I understand where I am, I know what my plays are. I know that I could like throw this microphone off the desk, or move this mouse, or write with the pen that's right in front of me. Like, my brain understands there's a water bottle. I could drink this. Like, I shouldn't do any of those things. It's going to be very distracting when I'm giving a Zoom conversation, but yet there they are, right? So our brain has a set of possible actions that it can take in any environment. And then it has an idea about how successful those actions are going to be, not only just given my previous experiences, but given my goal at hand. So my brain thinks I should keep answering Edythe's question because that is like what this game is right now. And I'm going to go for it. And then it's going to decide, like, ooh, was that as better than expected? Was that, what she's nodding? That looks great. Like, I'm answering, she's giving me positive feedback right now. So my brain's like, yes, keep going. You're doing it. Because my brain is a carrot learner. But if I thought I answered Edythe's question and she was like shaking her head like this, then next time my brain is going to go, okay, maybe you should stop talking, think for a few minutes, formulate your answer, and go, right? So essentially what happens is we have a playbook. We try something, and then it either goes as we expected, in which case no learning needs to occur. It was exactly like you predicted. Or that action that you try has a better consequence than you expected, in which case your brain does my favorite thing that my brain can do, and that is rains dopamine down. It says, you did it right. And dopamine is the motivating pleasure reward chemical that motivates most of us to go through life behaving in the first place, right? We're looking for those dopamine rewards. When dopamine hits my brain, not only does it make me feel good, it facilitates rewiring. So it's going to strengthen the links between this environment that I'm in and the choice that I made. So that if I find myself here again, my brain's like, I know how to get the rewards, do this thing. But the human brain, unlike most of our AIs, which also learn in this way through what's called reinforcement learning, has another path. And that's a path that learns when things don't go as well as you expected. I think this is really important to just say, because setbacks feel terrible. But for some of us, that's an even stronger learning opportunity than being successful. For all of us, setbacks and successes are the two mechanisms by which our brains learn from feedback. So if I did something and it didn't go as well as expected, my brain, I would feel a dopamine dip, which feels like, oh, disappointment. It feels crummy. I'm actually just experiencing it right now. I don't know why, but I will leave that place. And that dopamine dip, though, also facilitates rewiring. In this case, what it does is makes that action that I thought was going to lead me to a reward less available next time. My brain is like, here's the playbook. That one was resulted in a fumble or whatever. Like, let's not make that readily available to you. And I should note that the systems that I'm talking about here are totally automatic and happening largely under the hood. It's just like you're making these choices because your brain is keeping track all the time. And that's why, when I say our way of knowing someone or thinking someone is right or making a decision that feels right, when you talk about instinct or intuition or feeling in the zone, these are ways that your brain is driving you through the world in an efficient way that maximizes the success of all other behaving animals, but it's always based on your previous sort of trial and error. So what's I think is really cool is that these two pathways are largely independent from one another. The strength of these two pathways, they're related to genetics and dopamine signaling in the brain, but most people use a combination of learning, moving through life by moving towards previously rewarding things and moving away from things that were disappointing. But what we and others have shown in the lab is that some people, maybe 25% of people, are primarily making decisions based on either successes or failures. So we call these choosers and avoiders. People who move through life by moving toward good things. You might think, well, that's awesome. They're going to feel better. They're going to find the right answer faster. However, if one of those people finds themselves in a situation where they have to choose the lesser of two evils, they're in really big trouble. They have not paid attention to bad things. And they will tell you like this, 85% good choice or this 86% good choice. I'm picking 86 every time, but they know nothing about something that only has a 10% or 15% chance of being good. Like they just haven't sampled this low probability reward space. So real world, when we all found ourselves in the pandemic and we had to choose the less of two evils or choose the less sucky thing to do with our lives, these stick learners, A++, they know what to do. They know how to maximize success when there are no great options. It turns out the stick learners are also at an advantage to problem solving. So that's something we found in our lab. When you're working through a really hard problem, and it's not like push a button and somebody says correct or incorrect, but you're working through something that takes some amount of time. It turns out that stick learners are more sensitive to when their train of thought is on the wrong track. So the way I like to think about this is like my brain, a carrot brain or a chooser brain might be like, I'm chipping away at this problem. I'm making like a 1% progress. Like I'm going to keep doing whatever Wordle I'm going to keep using whatever Wordle starting word I've used or whatever, whatever it is that I'm trying to do with my life. Hopefully, that is something I do with my life, but maybe something more interesting. Whereas my husband's brain would go like, I'm only making 1% progress on this task. There must be a better way to do this. I'm going to let go of that strategy and try something new. So, and we demonstrated this in the lab using fluid reasoning or problem solving. And so anyway, the point is that carrot learners and stick learners do not learn more quickly from feedback, but they learn different things. And those different things set them up for success in different environments, which goes back to the idea that different doesn't need to be better or worse.
So let's talk about the fact that we're living in this age right now where the importance of diversity and inclusion is really blooming. People really understand it, and they're trying to make the world a better place. But yet, at the same time, there's an absolute obsession with being normal and having our children be normal, and the danger of not being normal. And when do we medicate to make the kids normal?
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if you can comment a little bit about what's happening in our generation in terms of prescribing and the extent to which normality is being sought.
Yeah, I think that it's even a little bit more than that. In my work, everyone is trying to make themselves better than normal, right? And so it's like the worrying about falling behind is one thing, but then there's all of this neurohacking and biohacking and how do I leverage the facts of my brain to be superhuman? And I think inherent in both of these is a misunderstanding of what normal means. We consider, first of all, we are either talking about normal as a societal value. So the word normal, the definition of the word normal actually has in it two things. One is conforming to a standard. And I think it's really important to evaluate who is giving you that standard if you're deciding to medicate or intervene with your brain. And the other is, usual, typical. So the other piece of that definition is about frequency of being away. So there's plenty of ways that are atypical, that are highly functional, right? And then there's this idea of conforming to the standard. And so I think the decision about whether to medicate or how to hack your brain is intensely personal. But I would call to people to say, is the way your brain works interfering with your ability to interact with life or your definition of success? And if so, there are many different ways of intervening. I don't think drugs are particularly good or bad. I think it's one of the ways that we intervene. Why would treatment with drugs be different than treatment with a math class? They both change your brain. Kind of depends on what it is that you're trying to do. And I think it's really important to say treatment is also not a one size fits all. Every clinician, which I'm not, knows that certain treatments work well for certain people, whether they're behavioral therapy, drug therapy, combination of them both, whether it's life coaching, whether it's a perspective change. It really just depends on what you're trying to do with your brain. And I think that the idea of neurohacking is really dangerous personally, because I think that people there's this narrow view. Someone is chiming in and they're saying, for instance, many people would welcome the opportunity to not have to sleep. Oh, we spend a third of our life, not sleeping. And I get funding from the Navy. And I know there's a lot of work that's done on, lack of sleep and attention and how does that affect performance? When you sleep, your brain clears out its toxins, and lack of sleep is one of the things that a predictor of dementia. And, sleeping is really freaking important for memory consolidation. And there are many trade-offs in other spaces where people might be trying to push their brains in one direction without understanding that the reason this is hard is because there's a trade-off. And if you push your brain in this way, you're going to lose something else. Who knows whether you want your brain to remember a lot of maps or the grocery list? It's you have to really appreciate what the cost of that thing is going to be, I think, before you go trying to push yourself in a different direction.
Well, you mentioned a little bit earlier, you touched on one of my favorite science topics in the universe, which is dopamine. And the world around us is very interested in dopamine, and it's in the popular press. There are books about, do we want too much dopamine in our lives? And I think of course, although dopamine is important in reinforcement learning, the concept that it's the pleasure transmitter and that it's all about feeling good is kind of misleading, right?
Totally. And that's what makes you want to be better, right? So, right? That's kind of like where you're going. I think that's where you're going is, I always say I'm for a growth mindset. I'm for learning to find your own superpowers and to find your niche. But we always want better. Like in that scenario where I was talking about outcomes, it's only when it's better than expected. It's not the absolute goodness of your event that gives you reward. It's only when that thing works better than expected, because if it was as good as you expect, no learning needs to happen. So you get a small little dopamine response. And I want to be sure to ask you a question, because I think that dopamine and drug addiction is so interesting and so important, and like what motivates us, right? So I'm curious what you think about this idea of different brain differences and how centered do you think it is in the field of addiction? And if not, why not? What are the complications there?
It's absolutely fundamental to addiction. First of all, there is a predisposition toward whether or not an organism is going to want a psychoactive drug. And dopamine receptors in the brain can predict who is going to want a drug and who's not going to want a drug. Not only that, taking drugs chronically downregulates the dopamine system, and it has a lot of horrible effects because dopamine is important in the brakes. There's a go system and there's the brake system. Dopamine acts on both of those systems, but the tonic system, where dopamine is always there helping you modulate what's going on and slowing you down so that you don't act impulsively, that system is preferentially really damaged by drugs of abuse. So you begin to have an imbalance so that dopamine is highly functioning in the go system, so that if a reward, in the case of addiction, the reward could be a drug opportunity. When that's in the environment, the person doesn't really stop and think about what they're supposed to do, but they instinctively go toward the reward. So dopamine has many functions, and it has a very important function in modulating behavior and in decision making. And it has a role in this one area of the brain that you've really focused on in your book. I love it too, the basal ganglia, right? Not just the cortex. It's not all about what's on the outside of the brain. Could you tell us a little bit about the basal ganglia, just a little bit, and their role in decision making?
Yes. I think the basal ganglia are the unsung heroes of the brain. I just want to say that, the conscious decision-making frontal cortex and cortical regions of your brain rely on the basal ganglia to turn up and turn down the signals that they think are relevant for the decision at hand. It's like having a CEO. Imagine having a CEO that doesn't have a great assistant putting what's important in front of them. Imagine that they've got to answer to everything equally well, and they don't have any sense of urgency or time. The basal ganglia do that for our prefrontal cortex. And I just want to comment on what you said about addiction and the basal ganglia, or the addiction and dopamine, because I think it's important when we talk about variability in brains to note that we change. It's not only differences between people, it's differences within a person. So think of yourself before and after a cup of coffee, or at the beginning or end of the day, or before and after you start a drug habit. Like, this gives you some insight on what it might be like to be someone else, because we are literally, if your brain makes you, we are literally different people at different parts of our life and at different parts of the day. And I think that your example highlighted that for me, the difference is not only between, but within us.
Not only that, not only do our own experiences influence the way our brains work, but there's a lot of really exciting interesting research on transgenerational trauma and transgenerational effects on epigenetics. So a person can be born with a certain genetic makeup, the genome, but how that genome is expressed and what proteins are formed is really controlled by the epigenetics. And transgenerational trauma can have a tremendous effect.
That's so true. That is so true.
Yeah. I see Vicky's coming because
I know. We're both like waiting for Vicky because we know.
I am so sorry to interrupt this fascinating conversation. I think you two could go on for another hour.
I could, for
This
sure.
is
Oh, yes.
so interesting, but I don't want to ignore the questions from the audience either. So before I get to them, I want to thank you both so much. This has been such a wonderful learning experience for all of us, and understanding our brains and the brains of others who we seem to gravitate toward, giving us really a reason why that happens. But enough from me. We have quite a few questions about the neurotypical brain and the neurodiverse brain, and how is learning different, and how can educators help those children with neurodiverse brains learn?
So I think that's a wonderful question. And I want to say that I love the idea. I love the terminology in neurodiversity. Neurodiversity just means that brains differ. Neurodivergent is a word that people are using to replace these kind of atypical or abnormal language. And I think it's a strength-based approach, which I really like. Moving away from a diagnosis or focus on my brain can't do X. Like dyslexia is a wonderful example of this. It's estimated, I read an article that estimates that 38 million American adults have undiagnosed dyslexia, and 2 million have diagnosed dyslexia. My grandfather, many people in my family have dyslexia. This feels like, I strongly recommend, if you have one of those type of brains, that you read the book, The Dyslexic Advantage, because it feels like, dyslexia is at the heart of many diagnoses of learning disability. And I'm putting this in quotes because written language is a problem that we have been asking our brains to solve for only a couple thousand years. Spoken language, maybe a much longer, like 50,000, depending on your favorite anthropological estimate. But the sort of vertebrate brain has been evolving for hundreds of millions of years, and we have been asking it to read for thousands of years, a couple thousand. Not everybody. School systems much shorter. And yet at the heart of all the ways that we learn is reading. So children who struggle to read fall behind because that's how information is delivered after third grade. However, the brain design that allows us to be good at reading actually involves handicapping the right hemisphere. And what I mean by handicapping is shrinking the right hemisphere of our brain to make the assignment of jobs more systematic between the left and right hemisphere. So Marion Annette did some really interesting work where she showed that there's kind of this axis in laterality of brain designs, where when people are what I call in the book lopsided and have much bigger left hemispheres, they have less of a risk for language and mathematics related disorders, but they have more of a risk for spatial and navigational things. These are really important problems that our brains solve for hundreds of thousands of years. So I guess I would say that our education systems, I feel like there's greater awareness for educating individual brains rather than people in a bucket. And the bucket could be typical, atypical, or the bucket could be dyslexia, ADHD, learning. It's so complicated. I think when we talk about neurodivergence or neurodiverse, we're getting toward a model where we're educating an individual brain. And I think that requires an understanding of the mind and brain at the level of the individual. It's just resource demanding, right? So then it's like, how do we get to the place where we can actually see a person as their constellation of characteristics and not as this bucket that we've plunked them in with a particular diagnosis?
Thank you. Edythe, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I think the diversity of the brain with respect to learning calls for an understanding of how one can speak to a child's talents, right? And design curricula that would make that child successful. And I hope that happens more and more.
Sort of like now precision medicine for the brain, right?
Exactly.
Or precision education, right?
Yes.
Right. Much better term. Yes.
Yeah. And then we've created this one size fits all norm for what it means to be a good learner. And that's a mistake.
Yeah.
It's a mistake. So hopefully we're moving towards a better model.
Thank you both. A couple of questions about the addicted brain. And I know, Edythe, that is your specialty. And how is the addicted brain altered by substance abuse or substance?
Well, first of all, everybody's different, and people have dependencies on different kinds of substances, and the dependency itself can influence what happens neurochemically and functionally. There are certain commonalities across addictions. People who have chronic use of opioids, cocaine, methamphetamine, alcohol, they all have a deficit in signaling within this one system of dopamine that's important for modulating and reducing impulsivity. So, in fact, the drugs produce that to some extent. And what I said earlier is that there's a predisposition for this D2 versus D1 deficit. And then the drugs make that even stronger. But the addicted brain changes over time. And what's very important to know is that sometimes recovery takes a very long time. The dopamine system, for example, can take 6 months to years to recover, depending on which particular marker for the dopamine system you're evaluating. Brain structure changes tremendously in people who stop taking drugs. There is, in early abstinence from chronic stimulants, there's actually, it looks like a shrinkage in cerebral cortex, but over the course of 2 years, there's an overshoot and change in the structure of the brain. People feel differently. The course of recovery is very different, and this parallels differences in brain chemistry. People have trouble thinking when they first go into recovery sometimes, but they get better. There is a marked improvement even over the course of a month.
Thank you. Chantel, did you want to add anything?
I would never step on the toes of the expert in this field. I mean, everything she said sounds correct. I would just say that I think this is where social support is really necessary. And like when you talk about differences in predisposition, it's so easy to judge somebody who's addicted as like a weak of character, lacking free will. And this couldn't be farther from the truth. All of our brains make us do what we do, and all of our brains are driven by genetics and experience, and none of us have a lot of choice in what brain we were born with, or, we have less choice than we would like in the experiences that we're fed. So I think social support, compassion, and an understanding that you're not the people who are addicted, the difference between the people who are addicted and the people who aren't is not your brain is better than mine, but this sort of perfect constellation of experiences and brains.
What we really need is a greater opportunity for people to receive treatment. It's absolutely shocking that something like, well over 90% of people who have chronic substance abuse problems don't get treatment. And treatment centers often don't have those treatments that are the most up-to-date or evidence-based. And the landscape for addiction is really changing right now, with well over 100,000 deaths due to overdose or poisoning, depending on how you want to look at it, in the United States last year, we now have a complete shift in what drugs people are using. For example, heroin is not the drug of choice for a lot of people. Even though fentanyl is absolutely deadly, a lot of people have fentanyl as their drug of choice. And in Baltimore, Maryland, people who came into one of these treatment centers where my colleagues work, all of them were fentanyl exposed, and the withdrawal syndrome is different. So we need to be evaluating new approaches to medication to helping people as the landscape of addiction changes.
Edie, do you think that this increase or that part of addiction is caused because we're putting our brains under demands that they're not naturally, or some piece of this is that people are under pressure to perform in a way that their brain maybe isn't able to cope with, and so they turn to drugs as a way of changing their ability to perform under pressure? Or
stress is a driver of addiction, and some very unfortunate cases occur when kids who are really susceptible to the effects of stress go to college and they're not in their familiar environment at home, and they get involved with substances of abuse, and they may be particularly vulnerable. It may be that one kid uses methamphetamine or even heroin once, and they say, oh, I don't need to do that again. But another one will say, oh my God, I found what makes me feel all right. So stress is certainly part of it, but I think the worst driver of addiction in our country right now is availability. How crazy is it that we've got all this fentanyl coming in, right? And we've had a history that kind of created what I would call the perfect storm. I mean, we had the introduction of OxyContin and the belief at that time that physicians were under-prescribing for pain. And then what happened was we had a lot of people using the opioids. And then we had a backlash. And the idea was, oh no, you really can't prescribe all these opiates. And so the people, maybe someone with rheumatoid arthritis or a chronic back problem, is now having trouble getting their OxyContin, and they move to heroin. Or prescription medications become too expensive, and so they go to something cheaper. So it's killing us.
It's so sad, really sad. We have a couple of questions here about ADHD, OCD. There's so many questions. I'm just trying to summarize because we're nearly out of time. Food addiction. Why is the brain acting this way? What causes this? You are the expert on the brain, both of you. So please.
I think ADHD is so I study mostly people who would be considered neurotypical in the lab, but we study a lot of attention and executive function, goal orienting, and individual differences in that in the brain. And the first thing I want to say is that there's a reason that it's called paying attention, because it's effortful. Paying attention is hard. It's using, again, mostly that frontal lobe basal ganglia to use, when we say pay attention, what we mean is to use an internally driven goal to guide our behavior. And depending on the country you're in and the age group you're in, the estimates about occurrence of ADHD go up to, like, I read one that was 9.5% of American children meet diagnosis criteria for ADHD. So here's something that we have determined is dysfunctional or isn't working well in the typical classroom, but is not atypical. I don't think 1 in 10 is an atypical way of being for the brain. And I think that it's important to talk about how to work with that strength and what an organic, other people call this organically driven brain is doing, that a goal oriented brain is not doing. So at the extreme end of this goal orientation is someone like the absent-minded professor, like my husband, who came to work wearing 2 different colored shoes, not just 2 different shoes, but one brown and one black, and just didn't notice the world. He's like focusing on grants or whatever, and not even aware of the world around him. When we're behaving according to a goal, we are by definition perturbing reality. We're turning up the signals on what we think is relevant. And at the extreme, we actually don't take in new information after we've detected our target of interest. Like maybe I didn't take in information that one of my shoes was brown. So I think that there are evolutionary reasons why having one person in a group of 10 who notices something that's unexpected or maybe not on task can be useful. Now, that person trying to operate in today's society where we're expected to sit at a desk or in a classroom for a long time can clearly struggle and needs to come up with strategies that help them be successful, or alternate learning environments. But ADHD is something that I think more and more adults are finding that they struggle with, and that's becoming more and more prevalent in terms of our awareness of something that impacts our ability to learn in these conditions that we've put the modern brain in. OCD, I don't know as much about, so maybe I'll turn that over to Edie. And I don't remember if there were other things in that list because ADHD caught my mind, one that I'm particularly aware of.
Well, OCD involves a lot of the same circuitry: basal ganglia, cerebral cortex, glutamatergic innervation of the basal ganglia, dopaminergic activity within the basal ganglia. And it involves a lot of it's self-control. And in either case, it's self-control. And it's largely the balance between responding to a stimulus that's in the environment without any kind of breaks and pulling it back and saying, wait a minute, let's not just do this. But there's a little bit of a difference between impulsivity and compulsivity, in that with impulsivity, people, act without thinking, they don't focus. But with compulsivity, which occurs in substance abuse as well, they get to the point that they're doing something that they're feeling that they're forced to do, like the boy who can't stop washing his hands. But I think in all of these cases, we talk about what's typical and atypical, but what's most important is what's functional.
Absolutely.
And when you get to the point that someone is dysfunctional, some intervention can be helpful. But I was accused that we had a grant proposal that had to go in at 5 o'clock. And at 3:45, I noticed that one of the figures had a line that wasn't quite perpendicular. And I was fixing it before we went to FedEx. And one of my colleagues said, Edie, they have medicine for that kind of behavior. And I said, well, maybe if I were medicated, the lab wouldn't be doing quite as well.
Exactly. Precisely.
That's great.
I think that illustrates that some of the things that drive us nuts, literally and metaphorically, about our brains are also strengths in certain circumstances. These quirks and the things that get in the way can also help us, can be our superpower.
One time for one more question, and that's about how people the Gen Zs that have grown up with technology, they're what Dr. Gary Small calls technology natives. And those of us who didn't grow up with technology are technology aliens. Are they learning differently, these Gen Zs, than we all did when we went to school? Because everything's electronic now, everything moves very quickly, and it's a technology world for them. They grew up with iPads, iPhones, all of that.
And they grew up with instant answers. And I think that that's one of the biggest, I guess I would say 2 things. One piece of technology is social media. And I think that it's important to note that our environments shape the way our brains understand the world. So if we're all in the same environment, we're looking at a dress and we can't agree about whether it's blue or black, imagine what happens when like a pandemic or social media creates worlds that are more different from one another. Once you start to feed brains different inputs, you're not even in the same room anymore arguing about the color of a dress. You're in different rooms looking at different dresses with a whole bunch of other people who see it just like you do. So I think that these like their brains are adapted to much more like-mindedness, I think, because of social media. Your smartphones know what you want and they feed you what your brain wants. So their brains have adapted in more sort of isolated or modular, more tailored ways to them. But also, I think when it comes to learning, what's fascinating about technology is that it creates instant answers. And I asked Alexa the other day what the difference between a horse and a cow was. I don't know why, but like, I was just curious, like what she would say. This is pre-ChatGPT and all these exciting things. I was like, Alexa, what's the difference between a horse and a cow? When I was a kid, I used to sit with the encyclopedia and start at A and turn pages and like find something that I thought was interesting and read about it. And I'm not saying that one of those things is better or worse, but there is you train your brain to work for long periods of time to find an answer, right? So like my way of learning was process-based. It was like, you have to learn to think, not what the answer is, or learn how to find the answer. And I think that when we're in the classroom, I think that also education was developed. I work in the University of Washington, and I work in a system like almost everybody else that was designed for a time when the experts were standing in front of the class because the knowledge was only in here. And they were talking to other people because that was the only way to transmit knowledge. And so our education system is still largely designed like this, but knowledge is like, the student can tell you right away if you're wrong, because they have ChatGPT or whatever in their, pockets. And so I think we need to be mindful about teaching children, Gen Zers, adults, how to think, not just what to think, because there are different, like access to information and misinformation is very different, I think, nowadays than it was for Gen Xers and beyond.
Thank you. Thank you. Edie, anything to add to that?
Well, yeah, I think that because this generation is learning different skills and different things, that's going to live in their brains, and there will be perhaps an evolutionary difference that's occurring there. But one of the scariest things that I learned about recently was this idea of, having Google implanted, that, yes, Elon Musk is, talking about you can have like a little chip put in there and you can even have it taken out and updated. So
that's really scary.
That's kind of the ultimate of the instant answer, right? Not needing to think anymore.
I guess what I would add to that is consider that if you were to do that, then you're taking someone else's version of what your brain should know and what it should do. Like the brain evolved to maximize success in the environment that you inhabit. And every experience, real or imagined, social media, worries, obsessions, daydreams shape your brain in a way that your brain thinks is going to optimize your success in the environment you inhabit. So, a lot of our Gen Zers are optimized. They live, in a technical world and they're optimized for that world. So, old timers like me might be like, I used to make photocopies of articles and read them, but that was like worked for my brain, So here's this like different, doesn't necessarily mean better or worse, but it comes with different patterns in thinking styles and different problems to solve, like integrating information, evaluating its truthfulness and so forth and so on. So I'm strongly against uploading chips into your brain because, first of all, I don't think it's going to work in our lifetime. But second of all, your brain is setting you up for success in your unique environment, and I think that will serve you well. I hope.
Well, thank you. That's a perfect note to end on. And as several people have said in the chat here, this is the most fascinating discussion, and I wish we had hours and hours that we could go on and hear the two of you in discussion, but unfortunately we are out of time. Thank you both so much for sharing this your vast knowledge and expertise with all of us. You've given us so much to think about in our brains and to unpack and use in our daily lives. So thank you both. And thank you to everybody that tuned in today for the privilege of your time. We're so happy to have you here and hope that you'll come back for more Open Mind programs. Our next one is on April 18th on mindfulness with Dr. Susan Smalley and Diana Winston, who are co-authors of Fully Present, The Science, Art, and Practice of Mindfulness. To all of you, I know it's almost spring break, and so happy Easter, happy Passover, and we look forward to seeing you very soon. Have a peaceful evening and good night.
Thank you. And please feel free to check out my website if you want to send me a question that you didn't get to ask me, chantelprat.com. You can also go there and play games that will give you feedback on how your brain works right away. So if you didn't get to answer your question, please feel free to go there.
That's lovely of you to offer that. Thank you, Chantel. All right. Good night, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.